Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Go for.
So yes, hello everyone. Welcome to the Friends Meeting House here in Manchester. I'm Councillor Ed Davey.
Councillor Deputy.
And we are both the Job Share Cabinet Member for Health and Adult Social Care in the London Borough of Lambeth. And we're really delighted to just introduce this item on the Lambeth Living Well Collaborative and the work that we and many... Oh, there is a microphone. I was doing my best projection actory voice, but this is even more fun. I love a microphone, don't you?
No.
Oh. It always makes me want to sing, but I won't, I promise. I promise. I'll clear the hall. No, you don't want to hear that, really, you don't. No, you don't want to hear that. Don't worry. So, we were talking last night about how Jackie and I met, and it was about 8 years ago, and we were both service user representatives on the Department of Health Ministerial Advisory Group on the mental health strategy, and we were there as service user representatives because both of us have history of using mental health services and caring for people who use mental health services, and now we're in charge of mental health services. So I think that's quite a good bit of modelling about recovery journeys and service user empowerment, and you know, and the positive things that can happen when you have the right support and the right relationships and the right attitude, and amazing things can happen. But that can only happen when people work collaboratively together across boundaries and recognise the strengths that everybody brings to making things better and supporting each other, whether that's service users themselves having a voice and having being empowered to make sure it's the sort of support that they need, or whether it's NHS colleagues bringing their expertise, or people in the council, people in the voluntary sector, or people in the community. We all need to work together to effectively support all of our citizens and all of our residents or patients or whatever we call them in our little bits of the system, in order for them to be able to fulfil their potential. And I just looked at, I always like looking up where I am and a bit of history, and there's a new movie out called Peterloo, which is about the Peterloo massacre that occurred just around the corner from here 200 years ago next year. And people gathered there, as they did in Lambeth, for a different march about the same thing, to get the vote and to reform Parliament. And that was about empowering people as well. So there's a long history of empowering people, of seeking to get power in order to take things forward. And that's what we're trying to do here in our own little way. So what we want to do is to inspire. We haven't got everything right here by any means. It's not perfect. It's not paradise, Lambeth. It's pretty near, but it's not quite paradise. But I hope there are some lessons that you can learn from, and I'm sure you have things to tell us that we can learn from you as well, because it's all part of a collaborative. I've gone on quite long enough. Do you have anything to add? Use your mic.
Just the importance of, in any local space, about having a sense of inclusivity in terms of the thinking and the decision making about how resources are being spent in relation to a population. And so the voice, my driver is about really making sure that the people that you're serving are as close to influencing the decisions as possible, rather than decision makers feeling or being like the font of all knowledge and the experts on everybody's experience. That is just, it's a delusion. And what we are striving to get in terms of being an alliance or a collaborative is not an alliance of those that are in the positions of power, but an alliance with the communities that you're actually serving, and that this is something that's sustainably developing. And I think that's the opportunity that emerges from such collaborative work, is that you have an opportunity to have better cooperation towards a more healthier population, because you're working really closely with them and getting responses or service development that really is in tune with what it is that they need. So everybody has ownership.
And just finally on that, it's really important, I think, to remember the social determinants of health. So we know, the less power somebody has, the more likely they are to become ill, and therefore it's incumbent on all of us who have any power to try and empower the people who are the biggest users of the service. And that's the poorest in our area, that's the blackest people, that's young people, anyone who has less power. And they're people that are hard to reach, and therefore we have to go out of our way and make sure we do everything we can to include them in the conversation. This isn't just about clever bits of bureaucratic alliance contracting, as useful and important as that can be, and we hope to show that. It's also about finding new ways of enabling people who are often very far from those conversations, being able to influence them. Otherwise, we can't provide the support that we need with the best will in the world. I do not know, as well as a young black guy off an estate that I represent, what will work for him. I need to get his view, and that's what we've also tried to bring into it, as well as the bureaucracy and the working between different bits of the sector. Anyway, as usual, politicians talk too long. So I will shut up and hand over to Dennis O'Rourke, whose full job title I can't remember, but I'm sure he will tell. Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks. Thanks, Jackie. I think they've said most of it, so I don't know much more to say. I've got 10 minutes to give a really quick rattle through what we've been doing over the last 7-8 years. Just wait close to your mouth. Okay, you can hear me? Yeah, over the last sort of 7-8 years. I'm not going to use the PowerPoint slide deck. Well, I'm going to use it in part. The last thing you need is Beth by PowerPoint at 8:30 in the morning. What I want to really do is hang sort of comments around 3 tag or strap lines that emerged from our early work going back 7-8 years ago, when many people are asking us, well, what is all this Lambeth Living More Collaborative all about? And I think these 3 statements, and a number of people in the room, notably Tricia, I think, and others might recall these, and they emerged out of our conversations as a collaborative, where we brought together people who use services, carers, particularly the third sector, who'd been squeezed out previously of conversations, which were dominated by the statutory sector, like the PCT in those days, SLAM, South London and Maudsley, the local authority, etc., etc. But what I should do is give you a quick overview of the journey. So back in 2010, we formed the Lambeth Living Well Collaborative, and that is basically our partnership engine, which has been meeting since, fueled by monthly breakfast at Abbeyville's, a local social enterprise cafe run by people with mental health problems and learning disabilities. Purposeful, a neutral venue, not the head office of the NHS or the town hall. And out of the collaborative sprung a whole bunch of ideas, which I'll come back to. One of our major service intervention system change elements has been the Living More network, which is, I suppose, most easily described as our front end to the mental health system. And that grew out of a range of prototyping exercises with people with lived experience. And the whole idea was to make support accessible much earlier, i.e. And to reverse the challenge, which was always that you couldn't get support unless you were in crisis. And that's been extremely successful, but it sat on very informal alliance principles, and you're going to hear a bit more about alliance contracting later. And then in April 15, we actually went live with a fully fledged commercial alliance agreement, and that effectively formed the prototype for where we're heading next, or where we are since July this year, where we've, as a system, created a whole system Living Well Network Alliance, which basically encompasses the totality of our investment across health and local government of our spend on adult mental health, roughly around £66 million a year. So, getting back to the strap lines. We don't know all the answers, but together we're more likely to find them. I think I guess you understand what's behind that. I think Jackie and Ed quite lucidly explained. But I think one of the key kernels for why we formed the Living Well Collaborative was because of this lack of inclusion involving the whole system in developing ideas, supporting the design and delivery of services that are relevant to people with lived experience and their wider networks. I think in Lambeth we have a rich history of developing such collaborative platforms. Jackie and Ed have been the inspiration behind the Black Thrive Partnership in Lambeth, which has been operating now over a year, which is attempting to bring the system together with local communities from our various Black, African and Caribbean communities, with a view to addressing the inequalities faced by the Black community within the borough. And we've got significant overrepresentation, particularly in the coercive end of the mental health system. I think the other thing about this strapline was the whole issue of humility. And what we mean by that is, in our conversations, there was a recognition, particularly for the need for the system. So by that, as it was then, the Primary Care Trust, it is now, the CCG, our Mental Health Trust, local authority in particular, but also the professionals, whether clinicians and managers working for those organisations, and the need for them to develop humility, i.e. they don't know all the answers, and that the way we actually work towards the solutions is by working as a whole system, bringing everybody together. And fundamental to that is relationships, building strong relationships at an individual level, but also at a system level. And again, we'll be talking about alliance contracting. The alliance contract per se is almost irrelevant. What is important is the quality of the relationships between those involved in that endeavour. The second, taking the mental out of mental health, heresy to mental health professions. What we were getting at here was, again, a conversation about how mental health, and particularly mental health professionals, were so dominant in many people's lives. You know, a number of, indeed, consultants would remark how many of the people that they were supporting, treating in quotes, their only friend they had was actually somebody within the mental health trust, whether it's a nurse, a social worker, a doctor. And that seemed to us collectively to be absurd, and actually in 2010 at the time, completely wrong. I think the other thing was that I vividly remember at the time in the PCT there was a big agenda about, you know, shifting care from the hospital, secondary care, to primary care, and many of us sort of asked ourselves, well, is that really the sign of success, that we shift people like batons from one part of the system to the next? And actually that's still quite common parlance in our systems today. So we sort of strongly felt that we had to address this, and this notion of taking the mental out of mental health. Ed mentioned the wider determinants. Mental health is only a small bit of people's lives. It's housing, it's income, it's relationships, it's community, it's self-worth. And they are as important, and that really informed our blended, more holistic approach to how we wanted to work, and ultimately ended up in us agreeing and coalescing around our big three outcomes. Yes, better physical and mental health, but also supporting people to become more autonomous through access to housing, work, income, better relationships, etc. And then thirdly, and really importantly, connecting people back to life. So our third strapline, supporting people back to having a life. All too often success is talked at in terms of the success of treatment or the activity. Actually, most of us want a good, flourishing life, and what you're going to hear from Hirila and colleagues is the impact particularly of the IPSA Integrated Personal Support Alliance programme, which was very much at the heart of it, focused on around 250 people who'd been written off by the system, whether social care or mental health clinical worlds, and some really inspirational stuff coming out of that. So I'm going to finish off by sort of saying that, you know, these are going back 7-8 years as key strap lines. Actually, I think many of us are now beginning to think we need to dust them down and actually begin to live and breathe these again. So I'm going to hand over to...
Hello? Morning, everybody. Can I have the mic? Good morning, everyone.
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Luli. I live in London, Lambeth Council.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hivana Rose. I'm Head of Service from Certitude. And I just wanted to give you a bit of a background with regards to Lambeth IPSA. So IPSA acronym stands for the Integrated Personalised Support Alliance. And this formed in 2015 in Lambeth, where we focused on working with a cohort of people, around approximately 230, 250 people in Lambeth that were living in restrictive settings. So they were in the rehab pathway, nursing care and residential care homes. And our focus was to basically support these people with creating a more personalised package of care so that people could step down from these restrictive settings and move into more independent living and create a life that people basically wanted to be living more than what we were prescribing that people should live. Sorry. I just wanted to share some of the accomplishes that we have been able to achieve from date till now. So we were able to reduce admission rates in the rehab wards by 60%. We reduced entrance into residential care by 67%. We increased discharges from residential care by 30%. And we've had year-on-year savings for up to 20% of the overall budget. Within the IPSA Alliance, we've also been able to create new services. So we had five organisations that were formed together, which were Certitude and Thameswich from the third sector. We had SLAM, NHS colleagues, statutory centres and statutory services, and Lambeth Social Services, and CCG. Yeah. Gosh, that would have been embarrassing if I had forgotten. Sorry? Lambeth CCG. Sorry. Yeah, Lambeth CCG. And we were able to work together and form and develop some new services. So before I pass on to Lily, I just wanted to give you a quick overview. Within the Alliance, Certitude were able to develop a 7-bedded step-down house called the Turrets, which was an intensive rehabilitative service that had clinical in-reach support from our partners within the Alliance. We were able to develop 9 beds, 9 flats on Roughton Road, which is independent semi-training flats. And we were able to develop a female-only service, a 12-bedded female-only service in Lambeth as well. Lolly is going to speak to you about his experience and journey within the Lambeth IPSA.
Yeah, my experience about, I lose a job, I've been in a hospital Lambeth, not Lambeth, and from Lambeth hospital I've been in Torres House, and I lived 1 year in there. From the Torres House I moved in Leyden Road, Brixton, and I'm very good now. Thank you so much for helping staff. I'm so proud of this country. God bless.
So can I just take the time just to elaborate a bit more on your journey? So Lully was staying in one of the rehab wards, that we provide in Lambeth. And you was there, how long was you in?
I'm from 2001.
Okay, so he was in Tony Hillis for quite a number of times.
17 years.
17 years, okay. And when did you move to Turrets?
2017.
2017. And you was able to form brilliant relationships with staff, friends, people that are living in the service and so. And how long was he at Turrets for?
1 year.
Okay, so he stayed at Turrets for a year and moved on to...
Brighton Road, when I'm here now.
Okay, so Rowton Road is...
From last year, November.
Yeah.
Coming here.
So he's living in his own independent living.
Yeah.
Come on, Lily, you've done a lot more than that.
Volunteer as well.
Okay.
Protection, and with horse as well. Works out City Farm with a horse in a stable.
He's
I like to
working.
help people. Yeah.
So Lolly's basically got himself a job. Yeah. And he's been working really, really well. He also volunteers with us as well at Certitude at Rowton Road.
Yeah.
You forgot all that.
No, I can't.
And has just achieved something really, really big because you've been nominated as our Volunteer of the Year award, haven't you? So we're hoping.
Do it sometime.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You've been, Lolly has been an inspiration, and he's really been, you know, evident and party to somebody that has gone right the way through the system and has benefited from our Lambeth IPSA alliance. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Neil Robertson. I'm the Interim Alliance Director. We're just going to show you a short film of different aspects of the things that we're proud of in our work in Lambeth. So.
Fantastic class.
That's fine. Yeah.
Partners working. I guess all kind of partner organisations have got strong individual visions and cultures, and that I guess be able to bring in support quite quickly around people that might be practical, or it might.
And I think it's time we got into talking more within the room. So I think we're going to do a bit of collaborative wedding planning.
Yeah. So we have an activity just to give everybody a taste of what alliancing actually feels like. So myself and Neil,
We're getting married. it was the proudest moment of my life when she accepted. For better and for worse.
So on your tables, you're going to see a sheet of paper. And it's basically outlined that you have a budget of £300. That's all you've got. Okay, so hold on a minute, Anne. So you have the resources, the skills, and the assets of everybody that's sitting around on your table. So that could be friends or family or colleagues or a neighbour or your community. Somewhere that you know that you'd be able to create the wedding of our dreams. So I've just outlined some of the areas that you just need to follow and tell me who on your table or who, what family member or what asset or what strength that it is you have that is going to deliver on creating, baking a cake for us. And also tell me, why you've picked that person as well, why you've agreed as a collaborative that that person should be in charge of doing the cake or the dress or the cars or... So we have 15 minutes. 15 minutes and £300 and the strengths of everybody around the table.
You didn't say that.
Are we ready? Boom! So we're back, guys and girls. So I'm just going to take my time and go round quickly for each of the tables and just get some feedback. How did it feel? So, this table, how did it feel? Planning my wedding. Did you? Does everybody on the table know one another? Okay, lovely. So we have here my cake. Amanda's making my cake. Who's Amanda? Has anybody tasted Amanda's cake? We trust. Okay, lovely. That's cool. Okay, so this table. Ooh, rings. So the rings is family rings. So whose family? My family. That's very clever. I like that. How did that feel? Okay. They haven't spent any money and they're going to invest that. You need to come to Lambeth. Come and help us. So what about this table? So, the dress. Tell me about my dress. How did it feel working together and getting everybody to agree or... Going away, Neil.
Can't wait.
Yeah. Is that what it felt like on this table? Okay. That's really good. So did everybody take responsibility for them, you know, like... Yeah? That's savings. That's just all savings. So this table. So... Okay. So who knew where the community cafe, like, who had that knowledge? Oh, excellent. Excellent. Okay. Asset mapping. Asset-based approach. Thank you. And last but not least, talk to me. Oh, I beg your pardon. I'm sorry. I'm coming. Sorry. The venue. Okay. Sorry, Pam. That's what I'm talking about. Thank you, everybody. So I just wanted to give everybody the experience of coming together as a collaborative and people that are not knowing one another and just learning how to trust and ensure that everybody's kind of like pulling their weight, knowing that you don't need very much, but if we work together, we can achieve so much. £300 and I've got a whole wedding. Let me just hand you over to Neil. Thank you.
So which plan are we choosing? We're going to take a combination of them all?
We're taking it all because I want that flights.
Okay then. So, as I said earlier, I'm the Interim Alliance Director, and I'm also an Operational Service Director at the South London and Maudsley. My experience of Lambeth was very limited up until October 2017, when we were I was thrown into a design process which is very similar to what you've just experienced in terms of the planning of the wedding. So I've worked in the NHS for 23 years, 26 years if you include my nurse training, and I've only ever really had that experience. And I was asked by one of our Alliance leadership team members, Chris Domini, who's the Chief Operating Officer at the South London Maudsley, to come and participate in the design process to start the development of the Alliance business case. And what you've experienced is exactly what I experienced in terms of, you know, we were very clear about what our values were, what outcomes we wanted to identify, but actually developing a high-level design plan was a very, very new experience for me, and it was a very positive experience. It was quite anxiety-provoking because it's very easy to hide behind the boundaries and silos of public sector organisations, and it came really, really clear to me that I either had to be resistant or I had to embrace it, and the best thing I ever did was embrace it. And I think that one of the most amazing examples in terms of recent developments is that when I was being moved from one complicated borough to Lambeth, one of the things was the acute inpatient bed challenge. And at the beginning of the calendar year, it was in there were quite a number of significant problems around that. But what's been really, really powerful about our alliance, about our relationships, is that actually we've been able to wrap around as partners and respond to those challenges, not necessarily with more money, but in actual using our sort of shared capability and resources to actually make a significant improvement. And I'm really proud to say, as a result of that alliance work, we are moving in a really, really positive direction, and there's been a significant improvement in our acute bed usage. So it's been a really, really positive experience. It's been a surprising experience as well. Again, what you've just experienced is not dissimilar to what I experienced, and I fully recommend that other organisations embrace it.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a shame that the video didn't happen. I wanted to see all the wedding and all the stuff about Lambeth. But just going to introduce myself. So my name's Mark Drewin, and I'm not from Lambeth. I'm from Yorkshire. Woo! Thank you. Thank you to all of the lovely Yorkshire people who've come here to share this with me today. Yeah, you're not. You were from Yorkshire, you know. Oh, all right. Okay. No. By the way, I do have security coming in for any hecklers. So, the reason why I'm here is because the lovely people of Certitude in Lambeth know that I'm a big fan of partnerships. I'll explain why in a minute. So they've asked me to chair the next bit, because we're going to have a debate and a discussion and involve all you lovely people. You've heard some great ideas about how people can work together, how organisations can work together. So I think we need to have a debate about how that goes. I'll just tell you a little bit about me. So I live in Leeds, and I work for Bradford Council, where we've got some great partnerships. Not quite as good as Lambeth, actually. I think they've outdone us a bit. But of course, when people think about partnerships, they think about health and social care, which is important, or health and social care in the police. But they aren't the only partnerships. One of the things that we love is an equal partnership with the voluntary sector, where power and planning is shared. That's one of the things Lambeth does really well. Other partnerships, of course, are with the community, and communities are really powerful places. But the most important partnership of all is the people who use services and people who live in the community, who should be running what they do and running the way the service thinks. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we do that, though, I just want to give you a story about my wedding, right? Because we're talking about weddings. my wedding, right, which was quite a few years ago in Leeds, we got the bus to Leeds Town Hall to get married. And when we got on the bus, there was a couple of old ladies, you know, the kind who have to, but their bus pass means they have to go after 9 o'clock. And we all got on the bus, and this woman turned around and said, "Bloody hell, you're the best dressed people I've ever seen on this bus, and I've been doing this for 15 years. So, you know, there's lots of different ways of getting married. But I hope you two will be very happy. Okay then, so we've got a panel. Would the panel like to come up here? We've got a panel of highly educated, very attractive and clever people. Brilliant. It's all right. So the idea of what we're going to do now is we're going to involve you in a discussion about how we can develop partnerships where you are based on the Lambeth model. So what I want you to do is to start thinking about interesting questions or ideas that you've got to be able to share based on this idea. But before we do that, I'm going to ask Moira just to say a few words about how the contracting system and about how the complexities of this partnership in Lambeth came about, and to give us a quick rundown on how that worked. Because the thing about partnerships is it's great getting everyone in a room and thinking and feeding exciting ideas, but you also have to do a little bit of boring stuff to get it practical, to get the money in the right place, and to get the things working. So if Moira can just tell us a little bit about how the contract works, and then we'll open it up to a big debate about how we do it. Go for it.
So I think traditionally the way that we would run off, so I should say, my name's Moira McGraw, I'm Director of Integrated Commissioning for Lambeth Council and Lambeth CCG. And we've had, I think that's
Is that better? Yeah, thank you. I was thinking I hear that lovely echoing. Yeah, so Moira McGraw, I'm Director of Integrated Commissioning for Lambeth Council and Lambeth CCG, and we've had integrated commissioning between Council and CCG for a while, but in earnest over the past 4 years. And as a kind of commissioner, as a planner, as a funder of services, we do a lot of work with individual organisations. So most of what we do is we have a contract. We can agree what an organisation is going to do, and we agree the money. And in the kind of conversations that we're having, the kind of outcomes that we're trying to achieve, what we would sort of historically have done would be to talk to lots of individual organisations. We might get them in a room together, but when it comes to the money and the kind of monitoring what's going on, all of those conversations are kind of between us and those individual organisations. And if there's a problem, we have to shuttle between those organisations, saying, organisation X is saying, actually, we've got a problem here, tell us what you're doing about it. And that works if you're running really kind of simple services, a very sort of task and finish, where you've got kind of individual interventions or support for people. It really doesn't work well in this kind of complexity of the systems and the outcomes we're trying to achieve. And the other thing is, a lot of those contracts are very short term. So health and social care is very good at very short contracts. And when I started working in a council, I was really struck by the fact that the waste contracts are 20-year contracts. Why are we doing 3+2, you know, in years in health and social care? And I'm wondering why we can't, you know, move money around the system. So we did a lot of good work in Lambeth. So the collaborative was a way of bringing people together without a sort of set agenda, bringing service users, bringing voluntary sector, carers, and all such organisations together. So the planning, the thinking, the developing the outcomes we wanted to achieve, all of that was fantastic and fabulous. And from that, we developed the Living Well network, which again brought, so we had a provider alliance group that brought people together, but we still had individual contracts of a variety of years, most of them were short term. So it managed to achieve quite a lot. But we knew we were moving into a system, not only do we have a real financial challenge about needing to make savings in the system, but to deliver the kind of outcomes and aspirations for our services and people in Lambeth, we knew that the mechanisms we had could only take us so far. So at that point, Dennis and colleagues were starting to cast around and say, actually, what's a kind of contractual and financial framework that gives us an opportunity to bring people together and plan together, but also to enable some of the funding flows to change. After doing quite a lot of research, kind of picked up there was this thing called alliancing, which was developed for the oil industry, which is about how do you get an oil platform in place on time and functioning when you've got often sort of hundreds of different organisations who all had a part to play. And it sounds like a bizarre thing, but actually it had started to be used in the public sector elsewhere in the world. So we decided to test it, and it was quite unique in this country at the point we started it. But interestingly, a number of health and care systems who are looking at integration and starting to adopt it. So for us, the key thing was to be able to have a set of outcomes that everyone was tied into delivering over a longer period of time. And we were able to test it with the Integrated Personalised Support Alliance, which was shorter term, but it gave us the kind of idea. Essentially what that means is you get, it's very simple really on one level. All the organisations come together with commissioners and agree to deliver to a set of outcomes and for a given amount of money. If things go wrong, everyone takes a share of the pain of that, so both in financial and reputational terms. If things go right and we overachieve in terms of savings, then everyone takes a share of that resource based on being able to then invest in future services based on mutual agreement. And the governance is really simple. We have an alliance leadership team, which colleagues like Fiona, Ashley and myself are on, and we have an alliance management team, which is responsible for the kind of day-to-day operations, which Neil leads and other colleagues are involved in. We've set, so what we just launched in July is a 7 to 10 year contract, which is very unusual in NHS and care, for £66 million a year, so over ultimately up to 10 years, that will be £660 million contract. We've agreed over that time frame, so particularly for the first 7 years, an amount of growth, funding growth, and an amount of savings. So really clear, and we've negotiated and agreed a financial framework that runs over that period. And then we've also agreed a kind of framework around what we're calling our pain and gain share, which will be based by year 3 on delivery against those outcomes. So if we don't achieve the outcomes, then there's an amount we've set aside which will kind of act as a penalty. But at the heart of it, so you can't just impose that on a system where people aren't working together. We've been able to do that because we've got to a point that that people have got used and comfortable to working together. And part of what makes it work is we're completely open book about the money. And that's been a real challenge, I think, is to say, this is the amount of money we've got, this is the total resource available in the system, so if you take a larger share of it, someone else has to take less money. And there's a real cross-challenge about how we're agreeing how the kind of services should be put together, what kind of outcomes they should achieve and how much they cost. And there's a lot of cross-challenge in that about, well actually, why are we setting up a service in a particular way with a particular skill mix of staff? Why does it cost that much? When actually we think we could do it differently with this set of staff who we think we might be more likely to recruit to, so you have a real genuine debate about not let's trim little bits off the system, so not let's go how do we take 5% off this service and 10% off this service, but actually with that given set of money for the outcomes we're trying to achieve, how would we use all of that money to best effect? For me, as Commissioner, I've been working in the NHS since 1992. It's been the most exciting, most revelatory and the most collaborative and outcome-focused piece of work that I've done, and it's a real. We've got massive challenges, as Neil said, in terms of really make this happen, but it feels so different because it feels like we're really using skills, knowledge and expertise, and I feel as a commissioner that I've got a really important role to play. We're not sitting on the sidelines, we're not just saying here's the money, go ahead and deal with all the problems. We are part of that process, and I've learned more in the last couple of years as a result of that.
Okay, thank you very much. I've managed to get this working by the time-honoured tradition of turning it off and turning it back on again. Now, would you like to just say a bit about how that works in reality on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to say a few words in relation to the kind of voluntary sector involvement. I think there's a number of people in the room that maybe are from the voluntary sector, and I think we have an opportunity to, in Lambeth, to really play a part at a systems level that, to be frank, we haven't had that opportunity in many or any really of the other areas that we work. So there is something very special about what that opportunity has enabled for Certitude and Thamesreach, the two voluntary sector partners who are part of the Alliance and the Alliance leadership team. And I think, you know, the conditions have to be right to enable that to work well. So there's an enormous investment required by everybody in forming and developing those relationships. You know, we have seen an attempt in other parts of certainly London to commission alliances and to kind of decide to bring different organisations together, including the voluntary sector. But in fact, if the trust hasn't been developed, if the conditions aren't right, you're actually not going to enable that to kind of happen effectively. So I suppose the biggest kind of tip or kind of learning, I think, is, you know, it is really worth investing in those relationships. Even if you never develop the formal alliance that we have here in Lambeth, you will develop a greater sense of, you know, being able to support each other with some of the rocky things, with the wobbly days, with the things that are a real challenge for people and for parts of our system. For Certitude, certainly for my board, it was really important that there was genuine alignment between what we were trying to do in the Alliance and Certitude's kind of vision and values and strategic aims. So that alignment was critical to me being able to convince the board that actually this was going to be quite a significant level of investment, a level of risk, and, you know, there is a pain and gain share associated with this. There is a proportionality to that, so certainly Certitude doesn't carry the same level of risk as SLAM does within the contract. It's proportionate to the work that we're doing, and in the early years of our next 7 to 10 years, more of that risk sits within SLAM, but as we progress, you know, more of that risk shifts into the community offer. So actually, yeah, and in practice, how that risk plays out is, if any partner in the Alliance is, you know, spending more in a part of the system, like perhaps acute beds, than we might think is right, we're all going to suffer, because actually we're not delivering on the aims and the outcomes that we set at the outset. So actually it's in all our interest, whether that penalty is financial or not, it's in all of our interest to be driving towards those shared set of outcomes. So I think that's, yeah, and I would just really encourage third sector providers to step forward and to kind of seek the kind of conversations at systems level that you absolutely have a right to, and will bring an expertise that you may not always feel is as valued, but certainly in Lambeth is absolutely seen as part of the solution. And you have to be open to learning about how other organisations work, you know, and that actually, you know, when a larger foundation trust or looks like isn't doing things quite the way you think they maybe should, it's usually because you haven't quite understood some of the challenges that they've, and actually if we can develop a better appreciation of each other, then we're more likely to find solutions that work for people.
That's a brilliant, thank you very much. Right, I just wanted we've got a few minutes left, just want to see whether anybody out there has any questions for the panel or statements they want to make about fabulous things that are going on in your area. There's a big gang of people who keep waving at us through the door. So we're going to bring it to a close. Yeah, I'm trying to ignore them, but we're going to bring it to a close as we would, but you're first, go on.
So the 5 members up front are the core group of the Alliance. And I guess there's lots of other providers out there that have always been providing in Lambeth or have come along and done some great pieces of work. And those providers, I guess some of those will be doing the same pieces of work, but the outcomes that you want to achieve are for the one outcome. So what will happen to those providers that are duplicating work currently?
So what we have is a core set of members of the Alliance. So we have a group of what we call network providers. And we had some early debates when we were going through the process about saying who should form the core Alliance, and there was quite a lot of testing of that. So a number of organisations said, we don't ever see ourselves being part of that core Alliance, but we think we've got an important role to play. So having established the first stage of it, we're now doing work with that wide group. So for example, we have a much wider group of people who deliver supported housing and supported living arrangements with a huge variation of cost, quality. So we're now going through a process about saying how would we look for a longer term relationship with that kind of broader group as an alliance with those organisations. We also said we would set the alliance up that there were some key, that it wouldn't necessarily be 100% fixed, that the opportunity and the doors were open over the time, over the 7 years, that other people may enter into the alliance or I guess potentially leave as well. And particularly GPs. So the way that our general practice was working in Lambeth, they weren't quite ready. We had an early debate about joining. Then they've now just informally approached us. So we think, not very immediately, but we want to start a journey about how we really formally now engage with the alliance, which is really to be welcomed. But we're working on a next stage procurement where we're looking at a sort of within the alliance at a 5-year contract with those supported living, supported housing providers, and there will be a procurement element to that, but it is in the spirit of the alliance. And there also are a whole range of offers within the community that we will never directly commission, so that the relationship between our kind of more local elements of that offer that support people to live the lives that they want. It's about being able to connect people into some of those other offers, and we need to be kind of cautious about the idea that the alliance will ever be, have full purview over that. It wouldn't be right. So it's kind of there's a whole range of different approaches, but we've got a more formal group of network providers that have a building their relationship with the core alliance.
Very sorry, but it seems that our lovely colleagues at the back are telling us that the people who are coming in next need some set-up time. So I think we've run out of time, so I'm really sorry about that. Thank you very, very much.
I think, given we have run out of time, I think if you do have any questions, any comments, do try and find me or some of the colleagues who are going to be around at various points during the day, and we'll also circulate the film on Twitter. And visit us on any of our websites, and we'll try and direct you to the right space. Thank you.
Folks, can I just say before you leave, there's a measure of chaos inevitable here now, because we've got loads of people out there wanting to come in. So if you're not staying in for the next session, just be kind of aware to be careful on your way out. Don't knock people over. Folks, if you are able to use the galleries as you come in, please do so, so that people who might struggle to get up to the galleries can use the seating space.
Right, how are we doing? Anybody else out there? Coming on in. Okay guys, are we ready to get going? Is there anybody out there? Right folks, how are we doing? How's everybody doing after last night? How are the collective heads in the room? Good, okay, fair enough. Brilliant. And who enjoyed the premiere in Fire Alarm this morning? Yeah, excellent, fantastic. So I think it was poor Marianne that did the worst because she was in the shower. But I think everybody else did manage all right. But yeah, that was a bit annoying, wasn't it? So is everybody up for raring to go for today? Full of energy, enthusiasm? Yes, Trisha. Thank you, Frances. That's brilliant. So, starting point for today. I'll let you introduce what you're talking about, Neil. We've got Neil and Tamsin and Eleanor. Lovely, brilliant.
Okay, good morning everyone. It's good to see everyone so bright and early. Of course, after your jollities last night, I'm sure you all went home and read in detail the EU withdrawal agreement, so it's understandable you'd be bleary-eyed this morning. We're going to be talking, building on yesterday's conversation, which focused on the potential to build a social movement. We're talking about building a story of change around which to build such a movement, and in particular we're going to be talking about the technique of framing and the opportunities that that might offer to us to win the change that we want. And I really want to start by saying, and I was really struck by this again yesterday, that even though we may feel despair sometimes, I think the thing that unifies this group and came through strongly yesterday is that we're in the hope business, not the despair business. And the whole of Social Care Future has been about hope, about offering a different future around which we can all organise ourselves and support and pursue. But to really make that work, we need a shared story of change. We can spend all our time saying what's wrong, but the reality is no one else is going to set forward that story of the world that we want on our behalf. That's up to us. We have to tell that story. And the other thing to say in relation to that is that unlike other fields of social change, for example, if you're trying to combat poverty or promote the rights of migrants or build support for human rights, what's odd about this sector is nobody is on the other side trying to change the story, trying to make it bad, trying to tell a really awful story. The stories that we read in the press, the stories that the public hear about social care, are the ones that advocates of social care are actually telling every day. So there's a big opportunity to change the story so that it actually better fits the world that we want to see. Now my contention is that currently the story that's being told is not only failing to command public and political support for that world, it's potentially actively setting back our course, setting back what we're trying to do. So this is about telling a different story. You heard yesterday morning from Jackie from Nesta talking about social movements. If you read their report on health as a social movement, the first thing that they say that needs to be done in building any social movement is framing what that social movement is there to do. So we need a story that articulates the world that we want and that is built a consensus around the values and the ideas and the things that we're promoting. But at the same time, that story has to be able to speak to a bigger and broader audience. It has to speak to the wider public's understanding, values, the way they think about things, if we're able to win their support and expand that movement. So we're going to be learning about how to get our message right using the technique of framing, and also hearing about some work that happened earlier this year. I wrote a blog post on the Social Care Future blog about the way social care was being discussed. And off the back of that, the voluntary organisations, disability group, CBT and Dimensions kindly put some funding aside that allowed us to commission some early stage research. And Tamsin and Elena are going to talk about the research that we did into how the public thinks about social care and also how the media talks about it. So I hope that you will leave with knowledge and ideas, but we also hope you will leave with perhaps a sense that you might want to get further involved, because to take this forward we need a platform, we need resources, and we need people to participate and take part. So I'm now going to introduce Tamsin Hyatt from the Frameworks Institute. He's going to give you a very, very quick lesson in framing and what framing is. We hope you'll be able to get some sense of it, and then talk you through some of the findings we have around social care.
Hello, can you all hear me? Yeah. Grand. So I'm Tamsin, I'm a communication strategist with the Frameworks Institute. We are a non-profit communications think tank, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it means that we spend a lot of time working out not just what people think, but also how and why they think in that way. Okay, yeah, all good? Okay. And then we take this information that we find out and we use it to help social movements, campaigners, campaign in a way that increases support and understanding. And we were commissioned earlier this year to provide some exploratory work on how the British public think and feel about social care. First, I'm going to start with why. Why we do what we do at Frameworks, and why framing social care, telling that new story, is key to creating change. In the words of George Eliot, "I'll tell you what's the greatest power under heaven, and that is public opinion. The ruling belief in society about what is right and what is wrong, what is honourable and what is shameful. That's the steam that is to work the engines." And for me, this insight captures exactly what we're trying to do here. We all want to better work the engines of society, to advance new ideas, new understandings, new behaviours, and to shift those ruling beliefs. And so public opinion matters. It can provide a fertile ground for change, or an arid desert where new ideas struggle to thrive. In other words, public opinion drives and preserves policy change. Now, it's by no means the only lever, but it is one of the most powerful. I'll unpick this a little bit with our theory of change at Frameworks. Communications can shape public discourse, and over time, the right communications have the power to shift public thinking, Eliot's ruling belief, in deep and abiding ways. And this isn't about getting superficial support or influencing behaviour in the short term. This is about changing how people understand and engage with an issue on a fundamental level. And we do this to create fertile ground and drive for lasting policy change. You may have noticed that this is a deceptively linear diagram. It's not always this straightforward. And sometimes an ambitious policy win means that we work backwards to make sure we can keep that policy in place by shoring up fertile ground and helping people understand why it's important. Because if we don't do this, we risk losing that win to the next decision maker as people come and go. Think, for example, of Cameron's order to get rid of the green crap after the Climate Change Act, May's pledge to scrap the dangerous Human Rights Act, or cuts to Sure Start funding after Labour. But we can do this with framing. And so we have a kind of common definition here. Framing is a set of choices about how we present information. It's what we emphasise, how we explain an issue, and what we leave unsaid. And this can mean making big or small choices, from the language we use to image placement or the values we invoke. And these choices can lead to radically different outcomes in thinking and behaviour. Because understanding is frame dependent. I'll show you what I mean here with some footage. This is taken from qualitative research on the framing of two different issues: addiction and early childhood development. Your challenge is to spot the difference in the before and after clips.
Somebody who's addicted to cigarettes chose to have those first few drags and rip the shit out of their throat and become addicted to cigarettes. Alcohol, they chose to have enough alcohol to end up addicted to it. As I said initially, leading to addiction is the susceptibility to addiction. And if you aren't exposed to it, and especially at sensitive times or at critical times, then you might not end up addicted.
So what do you think about stress?
It's a normal part of development, in my opinion.
What's the effect or the role of stress? Again, thinking about young kids.
That causes, in my opinion, long-term damage to a child. A lot of the emotional developments and the learnings that are meant to take place wouldn't happen in that situation.
Oh, did anyone notice the difference?
Yes.
Is anyone brave enough to shout out what their difference was?
It's like hypnosis, isn't it? They completely change their idea of what causes addiction or stress.
Yeah. The first man goes from pure choice to susceptibility and biology. The lady goes from stress is normal to stress damages development. These are both big shifts in understanding, one that campaigners working on this issue are seeking to build. And there's one more thing you may have noticed from these clips, one that is maybe even more important. Did anyone get that? Well, in his second response, the man begins with, "As I said initially." The lady says, "In my opinion," both times. He did not say that initially, but that was her opinion, both times. Psychological anthropologists call this the variability of salient structures. But what this actually means is that human beings are contradictory. We are complex. And we are capable of thinking very different things and much more accurately about something if we are given the tools to do so. And the tool here was a frame. Between takes, these people were read a short, well-framed, well-tested way of talking about addiction and childhood development. But not all frames are created equal. The right frame is able to cue and equip people to think differently, to improve public understanding and point towards effective political and social solutions. But not every frame will do this. I'll show you what I mean here with an example from our work on reframing criminal justice. We wanted to increase support for reform and new policies. We tested two different policies, two different frames even, against the control group. The first, problem solving, played to the idea that we Brits are cool-headed and pragmatic, and we need a common sense and practical approach to solve our over-reliance on prisons and punishment. The second message led with the facts, that our criminal justice system is costly and inefficient, and investment in rehabilitation saves money and improves outcomes. What's interesting here is that campaigners, groups advocating for reform, were typically using that cost efficiency frame. So here's what happened to people's support for policy change when they were exposed to these differently framed messages. So the problem-solving message increased support to a statistically significant degree. The cost efficiency frame actually decreased support. It was worse than saying nothing at all. Does anyone want to guess at why this happened? Yeah?
Because there's no votes in it. There's no votes in rehab, as far as I can tell, unless you give me the case to explain why.
Potentially. Anyone else? Yeah?
Austerity.
Austerity, yeah. We don't want to think too much about funding here. Anyone else? Yeah?
Is it something about the right good thing to do versus, oh gosh, the impact on me?
Exactly. So when we used that cost efficiency frame, it activated existing patterns of thought around justice as something more than transactional, about the right thing, and that you can't put a price on justice. So this means that the choices that we make when talking about our issue, when talking about social care, matter a great deal. They shape how people think, how people feel, and are willing to act. So the first step towards making these choices is understanding the landscape. What, how, and why people think what they do on a given issue. So with this in mind, Frameworks researchers conducted what we call on-the-street interviews on social care earlier this year. So they're designed to explore top-level thinking, providing empirical data on shared patterns of thought. So what I'm about to show you is by no means a complete picture, but there is a decent sample of views that will provide some insight and aims to start conversation on that existing landscape. we can learn from that video. But I'm really keen, first of all, to hear what
Can you get your microphone up?
Sorry.
Keep letting it drill, but it's very difficult to hear.
Sorry.
Right.
What do you guys think about what you've just seen?
All of it is true. In the first bit, it was about other people, but in the next bit, it was about including themselves.
They used the word looked after all the time. It wasn't about people having lives, it was about looking after.
Would the same knowledge work on the policy makers as on the people?
So when we recommend frames, we recommend frames that work across the spectrum of public policymakers, so on. This is a snapshot, so initial findings. So that's something that we could do later on, but I think we'll talk to that a bit later. Any more responses?
It doesn't seem that anybody's got an idea what social care is about. Everyone's got their own opinion about it.
I was enormously struck that the answer was money. That it felt to me like everybody was really clear that we just needed more money.
Two things were missing. The focus was on older people, which is fair enough, but that shows ignorance of need much more generally. And the second thing, there was nothing about attitude to people and respect and appreciation. It was about doing things too. So the second thing that needs to be changed by all of us.
I think it was really interesting that in the first question there wasn't too much certainty about what social care actually was. But in the second question people seemed extremely sure about what would make it better.
I thought it was interesting that people didn't recognise that it was something that belonged to them. It was somebody else.
Like that gentleman said, she should have older people on 43, and I've had social domiciliary care the last 3 years, and it's been the worst time of my life. So much so that I've ended up at crisis point and wanting or taking overdoses because of relationship breakdowns, because it's either their way, and if you say something, they then go and care. So yeah, drinking for me. Just everyone being in this room matters because people like your voice. So
I'm just surprised that so many people mentioned that it was a human right and an indicator of how we treat people in society. I wasn't expecting that to come across so strongly.
Basically what we choose to say and what we choose not to say. It's about values. Because most people are seen, when we talk about social care, as vulnerable people, but it's about also not talking what's not being said, it's about human potential.
When I heard like Labour across that thing about human rights and stuff, but there seems to be an illusion that social care is that thing that's funded, that is a service that we do things to people, but there wasn't a lot of response about the responsibility that we all have to support our neighbours or our friends or what people's gifts are that can be contributed.
Last one.
Change the mind when he started to
picked up on a lot of the kind of key points of what we found from this bit of research. The definition of social care is very hazy. People often used social or variations of care or looked after in their responses, using that as a crutch. And there wasn't much in the way of consistency when people thought about what and who social care is for. So a lot of focus on older people, but also younger people, the foster system, benefits. And very few mention care as meeting anything other than basic needs. And what was interesting is that even within this hazy definition, there was that clear sense of who social care is for, the vulnerable and the frail. So people who needed social care, again something you guys picked up on, were often described as helpless in well-meaning but very marginalising terms, as people who couldn't look after themselves. And the second dominant pattern within these interviews was about the state of social care, an almost universal acceptance of crisis. Despite people not knowing what social care was for, these respondents still described social care and the social care system as poor, a mess, or broken in some way. Solutions are harder to see and think about than problems, but even when prompted, these respondents only saw one solution to the current state of social care: money. And they weren't able to articulate much more beyond this. Which leaves us with a few challenges when talking about social care, when framing our asks for government from services and from society. Our first challenge is overcoming crisis and fatalism. So even within this small snapshot of public thinking, crisis frames dominated. The social care system was broken, in a mess. And our research found deep patterns of fatalism imbued in these diagnoses. The government, who was seen as ultimately responsible for social care, was described as inefficient, bureaucratic, and even with more funding, unlikely to change for the better. It's worth asking, and I think Neil and I think everyone in this room has been asking that, where this dominant story about crisis comes from, and how helpful that story is to the change we want to see. All of our work at Frameworks across a range of different social issues indicates that a pure crisis message rarely delivers the effects we would like it to. These frames either cue disbelief or trigger the conclusion that these problems are too big to be solved. Vulnerability, our second challenge, and again a very dominant way of thinking about social care within our snapshot group. Because when we talk about vulnerability without context, we risk presenting anyone who requires support as objects of pity without agency of their own or as problems to be solved. And this mirrors challenges from our work on reframing aging in the US, where default thinking around older people drew on ideas of frailty. Which leads to our third challenge, fairness. When asked why does social care exist, some respondents drew on ideas of fairness, that older people in particular had given much to society and this needed to be repaid. But when we cue ideas of fairness, we also cue ideas around deservingness, what we do or don't deserve. And that evaluation of individual choices that leads to entire groups of people being dismissed as undeserving, as less than. And our recent work on migration cautions against triggering this kind of zero-sum thinking, where supporting one undeserving group is seen as taking supports away from another. But we also have some opportunities here. Often when we're trying to change narratives, trying to tell a new story, we're in competition, not only with the stories told by others, but also with the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of our world. But from our snapshot, the definitional story of social care is hazy. there is space for our definition, our own story to take root. And none of our respondents dismissed social care as inherently bad for society or for the individual. Our second opportunity, again, bit of a mixed bag here, funding. Said with caution, because this is tied to that deep sense of crisis and fatalism I mentioned earlier. But every respondent mentioned more money, more resource as a means to improve social care. So again, assuming our snapshot is representative of the whole, a funding ask is in line with public thinking, and so with the right framing, is likely to get public support. What remains the question mark here is how this relates to less transactional asks, to asks that require systems change or social infrastructure, or that interrogate the way that existing funding is allocated. Which leads to our final opportunity, and one that a few of you picked up already: moral imperatives. So when asked why does social care exist, some respondents talked about fairness, but others described social care as a moral imperative, a way to respect our human rights, to live our values of social responsibility, protecting those who need it, and to secure equality of opportunity. And for me, this highlights our strongest potential vehicle or frame for change. An opportunity to shift the story of social care from a broken system for broken people to a recognition of the humanity in all people, to tell a story about efficacy driven by the moral ties that bind us to one another and to our world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tamsin. So I said it was a whistle-stop tour through framing. Please go and read more. There's stuff on the Social Care Future website, the Frameworks Institute website, and elsewhere, and we can circulate information afterwards. So that's why it's important what we found when the Frameworks Institute went to talk to people on the street. But we also did a piece of research to kind of gauge how the media was talking about social care, which Elena Semino from Lancaster University is going to talk about now.
Okay, brilliant. First of all, can you hear me? Yes. Everyone, yeah. Can you hear me too loud? Because that is a problem I have. Okay, so I'm a linguist, so I think I need to spell out what I bring, which is one of the challenges I was given as I came into the building. I'm the kind of linguist that works with colleagues to look at how we talk about things, especially in public communication, in order to understand, in our case, the current framing of social care. Tamsin has shown the framings that we get when people are asked, what do you think of when you hear social care? What we did is we looked at how the press in the UK talks about social care. And you won't be surprised that the framings we found are quite similar, because the media both reflect and reinforce what people tend to think. So I'm going to be very brief. There's a blog post that we wrote on the Social Care Future blog that has more detail. So first of all, what do we do in order to get evidence of current framings in the press? We collect a hell of a lot of data. So what we did was we took a period of about a year between 2017 and 2018. We took 8 national newspapers. You've got them on the left: The Guardian, The Times, The Mail, The Independent, The Telegraph, The Sun, The Mirror, and The Express. And we looked for articles that included the phrase social care. Then we put them all together in a big bank of text that we call a corpus. And overall, we ended up with 2.5 million words of news articles. Okay, so life isn't long enough to read them all and look at how social care has been talked about. But we have some clever software. And one of the software that we have, we're able to say to the software, look at all the instances of the phrase social care. Then look 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right of social care and tell us what company the phrase social care keeps in this massive collection of news articles. What kinds of words turn up around social care? Okay? And that is one way of getting at framings. So you won't be surprised. These are the top 20 words that turn up much more around social care than they turn up around other words. There is the biggest group is to do with funding and finances. You've got funding, you've got budgets, you've got cuts, fund, sustainable, etc. So you can see that the fundamental framing is about issues to do with funding and how much funding there is. But also we found, and these things are ordered by how strongly they keep a company with social care, you can see that in 4th position is crisis. So the crisis framing that Tamsin has just talked about, not surprisingly, also applies to the media. So here are some examples. I don't have time to read them all in detail, but you can see that the articles talk about a funding gap, spiraling costs, and the crisis in social care, which rebounds on the NHS. Now, we also looked at how people are talked about in the, oh, there's a missing slide, but never mind, I'll mention it anyway. We also looked at how different groups of people, specifically the elderly and people with disabilities, are talked about in this data. Concerning the elderly, there are 2 conflicting framings, and Tamsin has talked about how we often hold contradictory beliefs, even at the individual level. One is of the elderly as victims of insufficient social care, and the other one is the elderly as a burden because of the aging population and the costs associated with that. So those are the 2 main ways in which elderly people are represented. Then we asked ourselves, and actually Neil was asking, how are, and I quote the phrase that we looked at, disabled people represented in our data. First of all, they're not talked about as much as the elderly. They're talked about half as often. And usually when somebody in this data is presented as disabled, they're also either a child or elderly. So there's not much talk about disabled adults. And one of the things that is missing, and this is about opportunities, one of the things that is missing in these articles is any sense of people with disabilities working and contributing to society. The discourse is about vulnerability, and often multiple vulnerabilities. So that is a story that is just not being told, at least in this vast amount of data. So basically, to conclude, the framing in the press is primarily a framing to do with crisis that is due to funding, lack of it, and an aging population primarily. But there's very little emphasis on solutions, so it's primarily a discourse about problems. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. So I think what we see there, I imagine, for many of you, is a fundamental gap between what most of you in the room think and feel and aspire to, and what the public is being told and what the public think. The public are seeing and hearing social care primarily as a cost, primarily just about basic life and limb support. They're not hearing about the aspirations of working age disabled adults. They're imagining or hearing values and ideas of vulnerability and frailty. So there's a gap here. But the opportunity, as you said, is the public doesn't really understand this. So they're kind of relying on information that they're kind of grasping from here and there. What I would say though, and this is a piece of research we need to do in more depth, but from a very rudimentary look at the communications of a great many NGOs in this space.
What's an NGO?
Sorry, charities. It is them that are pumping out the crisis communications and telling a story of social care, which is just reduced to washing, feeding, getting up. They can understand the politics of that, sort of sense of despair, a sense there is a crisis, we just need to get to the next stage and a bit more money and a bit more money. But the reality is this is a debate that's been going on for at least a quarter of a century. In 1996, Tony Blair said nobody should have to sell their home to pay for their social care. We're now a quarter of a century on and we've not cracked it. So my contention is the story that is being told is at least in part responsible for that, because we're telling a story that is creating, Tamsin said, fatalism, which is where the intention of talking about crisis is to say something must be done about this. But the effect of it over time is that people think, well, nothing can really be done about this. So we have to change that story and we have to push it onto more hopeful, fertile terrain. But that takes research and it takes time and it takes work. And that's what I just want to talk about briefly before we show you a sort of a film evidence of the difference that this kind of work can make. And I've just put that slide in there, some of the kind of themes that came out of this. Crisis, pressure, crumbling, vulnerable people. And you can all test this afterwards. Go out of here, Google, or do it now on your phones if you want. Google Social Care, kick images. That is the one that overwhelmingly will come up. It's a stock image and it's absolutely everywhere. And that is a frame. That is the idea many people will default to in their heads. Or probably more likely as well an image of somebody in a care home. But that's what's coming to mind for many people when they think about the issues we're concerned about. So what is this about and what it's not about? It's not about measuring and responding to public preferences concerning how social care is funded. That might be part of it. And that, sadly, is much of what this debate is about. When Martin set about this effort, Social Care Future, one of the ground rules was we're not going to talk about funding. That's there, it's part of this debate, we can't ignore it, but we want to talk about the social care that we want, and what it means and what it does and why it's valuable. So that's not what this is about. And actually I should say now, it might not be about social care at all, because we might want to actually abandon that idea and talk about something else entirely, but that's probably a bit too much to get into today. It's a scientific approach to framing public understanding, as you've heard. Others are doing this work. So this isn't, we're not offering something new here that no one else is trying out. One of the most significant pieces of work going on currently around this is the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's work to reframe poverty. And there's a lot of information on their website about that if you're interested, and you can find out more. Again, they have a major campaign to end poverty in the UK, and slap bang at the heart of that is telling a better story. To try and move away from the strivers versus scroungers narrative that has been there around social security into something that can move us forward. There's work going on reframing homelessness that Crisis are doing. The Robertson's Trust in Scotland are doing work on reframing children, the story of children in care. So lots of different organisations and movements are thinking about this at the moment. And importantly, as Tamsin said, it's not a silver bullet on its own, it's part of a jigsaw. It has to go alongside putting forward kind of credible, practical solutions and policy proposals. Has to go alongside and is part of social movement building. So this isn't something you just do on its own and it kind of changes everything. It's part of a broader process of change. What's involved? So the research we have is really at the foothills of this. This is kind of basic stuff just to get a sense of where the debate currently is. If we want to move it forward, we need to look at what experts and individual experts in the broadest sense, those affected by social care, those who are working at, those all of you, think and say about social care today and what you want for the future. So there needs to be a degree of consensus about what the story is that we want to tell, and that's an absolute key part of the work and quite a challenging element to it. We need more data about how the public thinks, the cognitive interviews that you saw there, more survey data. We need to look at existing communication strategies. So I've had a superficial look at how these various charities are communicating, but we need to look in more depth at how social care is being talked about and the impact that has on people, how that leaves people thinking about social care when they read it. We then need to begin thinking the sort of frames that could shift thinking. What are the values we need to invoke, the ideas we need to put across, metaphors that we might use to help people understand social care, and we need to carry out research to test those. And then the upshot of that should be a kind of way forward that will help us all think about how we can talk about social care, or however we choose to recast social care in future. Then of course we have questions about how we use that data. Is that about training and helping us all use it individually? Or do in future we want to actually develop a campaign? Do we want to develop a campaign around these messages and these ideas to bring about that future? But that's something down the line. And I'm not going to show that film, but we're going to show another one now, if Tamsin can cue that up. Does anyone, before we show you this film, does anyone have any questions or comments?
I can share. I'll share, sorry. Let's share. So it's just to say, from the NHS England's personalised care group, there's been efforts to engage with practitioner communities, and what we've noticed over time, that in fact the actual chapter of this, is that there has been a change in perception around things, particularly like mental health budgets, where for some time publications like Pulse were really anti, and now they're not. So there are shifts in opinion. It feels like that would be a really complementary piece of work to do, to look at what specialist press from different clinician groups would be saying for the major stories around health and social care. But we think that there is some ground that we've made over the last couple of years from just the work that group's been doing. And I don't know why or how, but there is something there that's interesting.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's always worth remembering that professionals are people and are kind of equally affected by dominant frames, even though there might be kind of specific motivations within systems like the NHS that you also need to contend with and deal with to move people forward. There first.
Well, I was thinking a bit about. Sorry, I was thinking about schools, and I wonder if you'd ask people who've grown up in school with disabled children in the school and what their view of all this is, and the people who haven't had that experience, because in my experience, it's completely different.
I think that's a really important point and one of the challenges we have here, because what we were perhaps hearing from people wasn't their attitudes to social care, it was their attitudes to the people they associate social care with, and therefore that leads us into broader questions about attitudes to disabled people and older people in society. So I think yes would be my answer, but it's something we would need to think about carefully in taking the work forward about how broad we try to go. Somebody's that's right.
I think we've heard a lot about data, we've heard a lot about what other people think. As someone with lived experience, as a family carer, I want to be talking about what we here in the room today are going to do, how we are going to start our campaign. That's what I want to be talking about. I don't want to keep hearing about other people, I don't want to keep hearing about data, I want to hear about what action we're going to do.
That's a fair point. I think all I would say is that this is about informing that action, and part of that action is to be able to reach and persuade people that you need to reach and persuade with any campaign, and an absolute key to that is learning how to tell the story of what you're trying to do effectively. So this is absolutely about action to kind of change that terrain. It's not. I need to understand what other people think is to be able to do that as well as possible, not to put their priorities first, if you like.
But what time does your session finish? Are you going to have time to start reading about that? Because it said we finish
We gave them an hour to introduce this stuff, and the point of this is to ask people the question, does it sound like we need to tell a different story and use this methodology to tell that story differently? And most people in the country don't think it is. And most people in the sector don't think we need to. Charities are telling the wrong story, local government is telling the wrong story. We've got to come up with our story, we've got to use this kind of method to be effective in telling that story. So what we're trying to do today is find out whether people agree. If people agree we need to tell a different story, then let's organise ourselves to work out how we're going to do that. Will be my answer to that.
And also, I didn't check, I don't know if there is space later, but if there is anyone in this room who wants to spend some time later thinking forward, I'd be very happy. I'm around all day.
Space opportunity later on, so if people really want to get around that question, where we go from here, let's do that.
Yes.
As I said before, it really has impacted me, domiciliary care. It's been the worst years of my life. And that picture that you put up there is always hand holding, but it's not my hand, it's not younger people's hands and that. And I basically took 2 overdoses in the last week because of domiciliary care being pulled, and I'm a complex person, so as soon as you say something, your package gets pulled, and that is a stark reality. And I think those are some of the conversations that need to be had. So I now understand why people don't say anything, because they just pull it straight away. And I know that I'm not the only one that this is happening to. So yeah.
Thank you. I mean, it's a really powerful point about power in that system and how we can change that. And I guess this is a means to an end. What I think we all share an interest in this room is changing that power relationship so that you're not subject to those sorts of things. This is just one technique by which we might help or begin to achieve that. Gary next, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to say that.
I was going to say that the social care should be part of the national health scene and working together. And I feel that there's got to be more in the social care for working class adults as well. And like the National Health Service is for everyone, social care should be for everyone.
I think that's a really important point. It's seen as a kind of thing for other people, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, we need to change the message, but there's a lot of people with learning disabilities up and down this country that have lost their voices because they've lost their local self-advocacy group. We need to build, if we are to change the message, we need to rebuild people with learning disabilities and people with disabilities' voices.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think if you think back to Eleanor's point from the evidence that, and also the public thinking, positions people as vulnerable. It positions people as objects of care. There's rarely anything in that about people being, if you like, in charge of their own lives and their own spokespeople, and you know that's evident in what's happened in terms of self-advocacy in other areas as well. So it's just something. So.
Lines are myth. What? Difficult. This government closed the which we must fight, get back. It is not working.
I think the point he's making is, initially, social care did care in the home. The ILF did stuff when you went outside, when you went to college, when you went to the gym, whatever. With the closure of the ILF, social care no longer looks at that part of your life. They're looking just at what care you receive, and that they're cutting.
Yeah, and again, if you come back to the link between that and the story that's being told and heard, nobody's telling the story of care and support as giving people a broader life. It's all just about life and limb care in the home. So if we want to kind of defend those things and defend independent living in a broader sense, then we have to be out there telling that kind of wider, broader story of what this is really about. Sorry, you and then, sorry. Sorry, there was somebody
I seen something that was shared on Facebook on Tuesday from the evening paper in Oldham about a new care village being built there. Who owns this care village? My call. Who's the main shareholder? Oldham Council. And who's one of the people on the board of that company? the Commissioner, Mark Warren. Well, that does make it a bit hypocritical when councils are trying to put people more inclusive in the community. Then on the one hand, they do villages which exclude us. And there's another company based in the Trafford area called HPV. They have places like this all over the country. They have one down the road from their office in Timperley, and that's even more too close comfort for people in GM and Cheshire Mersey. 2 in St Helens, and they've just acquired an old shop building in Warrington and they plan to turn it into flats for people with disabilities. This is unacceptable!
A crucial point, really well made, and again I think this comes also back to language, because the scheme that's being developed in Oldham, if you read the press release and the newspaper thing, it's going to create jobs for people in Oldham. It's described as offering people independent living. It's an institution by any other name, and we need to begin challenging those models and those ideas, invisible institutions that are appearing all over the country. So that is also about framing and the language. There's one here.
Well, I didn't really want to follow that.
Okay.
I suppose my point was I'm always
really conscious that when you're trying to change the rhetoric of the here and now, there's another generation coming through that are being still embedded into the traditional one. And even though for lots of adults using social care, the reality is when a baby's born, it's health that's the most immediate support system around them before social care sticks in or kicks in. And the narrative there is still very much about need and misery and lifelong dependency. So yes, I agree about changing the current narrative, but unless you get in now for that, because families believe very quickly. I think by the age of 5, unless you're challenging that narrative, the damage is already done. So
yeah, and I also think at the other end of life, I think this isn't just about how the broader public feels. I think in my own experience in my parents' current situation, this narrative affects the willingness of older people to engage with the social care system and to see it as a threat rather than something that's actually going to extend their independence. So it's got a very kind of real meaning in those individual conversations and perceptions, hasn't it? We're going to have to wind up, but we just want to show you a quick film before we do, so you kind of see what this can mean in action.
So does everyone here remember the NSPCC advert around child abuse with the Full Stop campaign? Yep. So that was a kind of formative advert of my childhood. Very, very bleak, very, very scary, and it has stuck in popular consciousness. We are doing some work with the NSPCC and a few other children's organisations on reframing child protection and child development. And here is one of the adverts that we have worked on together.
My name's Alfie. My dad died when I was 3. So it's just me and my mum. But a few years ago, she met a man called Alan. He started off being nice, but when he got drunk, he hit my mum. One night, he came home and punched me in the tummy. It really hurt. When we got back from the hospital, the NSPCC started to help us. Now we see them a lot. Mum says we're going to be okay. My name's Alfie, and I'm an astronaut.
When a child is free from abuse, they're free to dream again. We help keep 1 million children a year safe from abuse and neglect. Your donation can take a child anywhere.
Do you want to say anything about that?
So it's a big shift from previous framing. And one of the biggest shifts that we've worked with the NSPCC to achieve is a sense of hope, of freedom, of what can happen when a child is free from child abuse. and what that child can go on to do. And that's a big shift in framing, in presentation, from the kind of despair and terror of the Full Stop campaign.
So I think the important message there is this. This isn't about negating the problems or the challenges that we're facing or kind of ignoring them, but it is about giving people a sense of why we're doing this. Why is what you do valuable to people in the round? What is the difference it makes to their lives? And making sure that first and foremost our communications concentrate on that, the change that we're trying to bring, not the current kind of problems that we're in. And so if you take one thing away, as I said at the beginning, we're all of us in the hope business rather than despair business. Let's just make sure that that's how we communicate about what we do as well. Thank you.